What if I told you the person most likely to survive a narcissist is not the kindest, not the most patient, and not even the strongest? In reality, the one person who actually comes out intact is often the one people misunderstand the most. If this is already shifting how you see things, take a moment to reflect. Have you been trying to win a game that was never designed for you to succeed? Most people assume survival in a narcissistic dynamic comes from being emotionally strong, endlessly patient, or deeply understanding. But that belief is exactly what keeps them stuck. The real turning point is boundaries, and not the kind people casually mention, but solid lived boundaries that don't bend under pressure, guilt, or manipulation. Because in these relationships, your empathy, your willingness to listen, your desire to fix things, those are not strengths in the way you think. Without boundaries, they become entry points. A narcissistic person doesn't test how much you care. They test how much you will tolerate, and if there is no clear line where you stop, they will keep pushing. Not always because they consciously plan to destroy you, but because the dynamic rewards them for doing so. Boundaries are what interrupt that cycle. They shift you from being available on demand to being selectively present. That means you stop over explaining yourself, you stop defending your reality, and you stop engaging in circular conversations that lead nowhere. It also means accepting the discomfort that comes with saying no, with walking away, with being misunderstood. Because when you first enforce boundaries, it doesn't feel empowering. It feels wrong, selfish, even harsh. That's the conditioning speaking. The person who survives learns to tolerate that discomfort without slipping back into old patterns. They understand that boundaries are not about changing the other person. They are about limiting your own exposure to harm. And once those limits are real, not just spoken, but enforced, the entire dynamic begins to lose its hold. Empathy without limits is often praised as a virtue, something that makes you a good partner, a good listener, a good human being. But in a narcissistic dynamic, unlimited empathy quietly turns into self-erasure. You begin by trying to understand them, their past, their pain, their triggers. You excuse behaviors because they've been through a lot. You give second chances, then third, then endless ones, believing that your understanding might finally create change. But what actually happens is far more subtle and far more damaging. Your empathy gets redirected. Instead of being a balanced mutual exchange, it becomes one-sided. You start prioritizing their emotions over your own reality. You minimize your hurt because theirs feels louder. You stay silent to avoid conflict. You forgive without repair. And over time, you stop asking a very basic question: what is this costing me? This is where empathy without limits becomes self-destruction, not in a dramatic, obvious way, but in slow, quiet ways. Your confidence erodes. Your sense of clarity blurs. You begin doubting your own perceptions because you've spent so much time trying to validate theirs. And the more you give, the more is expected because the dynamic has learned that your empathy has no boundary. The person who survives learns something that feels almost unnatural at first. Empathy must have edges. It must include you. That means you can understand someone's pain and still refuse to accept behavior that harms you. You can care about their struggles and still choose distance. It's the shift from "I understand you, so I'll stay to I understand you," and that's exactly why I need to step back. One of the biggest misconceptions is that narcissistic dynamics are drawn to weak people, as if there's something inherently lacking in those who get pulled in. But that idea doesn't hold up under scrutiny. In reality, narcissistic individuals are often drawn to people who are capable, attentive, emotionally aware, and willing to invest deeply. What they are really looking for is not weakness, it's accessibility. Accessibility means you are available to engage, available to respond, available to explain, and most importantly, available to stay. It means you carry the emotional weight, you lean into conversations that go nowhere, and you keep showing up even when the interaction leaves you drained. The more accessible you are, the more the dynamic has room to grow. It's not about how strong you are internally, it's about how much of yourself is consistently within reach. This is why highly empathetic and responsible people often find themselves in these cycles. They don't walk away easily. They believe in working through things. They assume that if there's a problem, it can be solved with enough communication and effort. But in this kind of dynamic, that openness becomes the very thing that keeps the cycle going. Your accessibility becomes a resource that is constantly used. The shift happens when you begin to reduce that access, not in a reactive or dramatic way, but in a deliberate, consistent one. You stop being immediately available. You stop engaging in every emotional pull. You start choosing when and how you show up instead of defaulting to constant presence. And in doing that, you change the entire structure of the interaction because the dynamic can no longer rely on your constant participation. The type of person who ultimately survives a narcissistic dynamic is often misunderstood, even judged by others. They're labeled as cold, distant, unfeeling, or even arrogant. From the outside, it can look like they don't care enough, like they didn't try hard enough to make things work, but that perception completely misses what's actually happening beneath the surface. What people interpret as coldness is often the result of hard-earned emotional clarity. This person has already gone through the phase of over-giving, over-explaining, and over-investing. They've felt the confusion, the self-doubt, the exhaustion of trying to fix something that keeps breaking in the same way. And at some point, they realize that continuing to engage in the same way will only deepen the damage, so they shift, not because they lack emotion, but because they've learned to protect it. Their detachment is not about shutting down as a person. It's about shutting the door on a pattern. They stop reacting to provocations that once pulled them in. They stop chasing validation or clarity from someone who withholds it. And instead of trying to be understood, they become comfortable with being misunderstood. That's the part that looks harsh to others, but it's actually a sign of growth. Because the truth is, survival in this dynamic doesn't look like emotional intensity. It looks like emotional discipline. It looks like choosing silence over explanation, distance over engagement, and self-preservation over approval. And while that may not fit the traditional image of a good or loving person, it is exactly what allows someone to step out of the cycle and remain out of it. Emotional independence is often misunderstood as not needing anyone, as being completely self-sufficient or detached from relationships. But in reality, it's something much more grounded and powerful. It means your sense of self is not constantly being negotiated based on someone else's reactions, moods, or approval. In a narcissistic dynamic, this becomes the defining line between staying stuck and breaking free. When emotional independence is missing, you find yourself checking everything against them. You look for validation before trusting your own decisions. You question your feelings if they don't align with what you're being told. You wait for reassurance, for acknowledgement, for some form of emotional stability that never fully arrives. And in that waiting, your inner world becomes dependent on an external source that is inconsistent at best and destabilizing at worst. Developing emotional independence disrupts that entirely. It means you can feel hurt without needing them to admit they hurt you. You can recognize a pattern without needing their agreement. You can make a decision to step back without requiring their understanding or closure. That shift is subtle, but it changes everything because you're no longer tied to their responses in order to move forward. This doesn't mean you stop caring or that you become unaffected. It means your care no longer overrides your clarity. You begin to trust your own perception even when it's inconvenient, even when it leads to difficult choices. And most importantly, you stop outsourcing your worth. Because once your emotional state is no longer controlled by their behavior, the dynamic loses its ability to keep pulling you back in. Over-explaining and constantly seeking closure feels like the right thing to do, especially if you value honesty and communication. You think that if you just say it the right way, if you just clarify your intentions clearly enough, something will finally click. You replay conversations in your head, refine your words, and go back in hoping this time it will land differently. But in a narcissistic dynamic, that instinct doesn't resolve anything. It keeps you stuck. Every time you over-explain, you're operating under the assumption that the other person is engaging in good faith, that they want to understand you the way you're trying to understand them, but that's not always the case. Your explanations can get twisted, dismissed, or used against you. What you intended as clarity turns into more confusion because the conversation isn't about truth, it's about control. And the more you try to clear things up, the more material the dynamic has to keep going. Seeking closure works the same way. You wait for an apology, for acknowledgement, for some moment where everything is finally named and understood, but that moment often doesn't come. Or if it does, it's incomplete, inconsistent, or quickly undone by the same patterns repeating again. So you stay engaged, thinking closure is just one more conversation away, when in reality, the act of waiting is what keeps you connected. The person who survives begins to see this clearly. They realize that not every situation will give them a clean ending. So instead of chasing closure, they create it internally. They stop explaining themselves to someone committed to misunderstanding them. And in doing that, they remove themselves from the loop that once kept pulling them back in. The ability to tolerate discomfort is one of the most overlooked traits in breaking free from a narcissistic dynamic. Most people don't stay because they don't see what's happening. They stay because leaving, pulling back, or setting limits feels deeply uncomfortable. That discomfort shows up as guilt when you say no, anxiety when you don't respond, and an almost physical urge to fix the tension when things feel unresolved. In these moments, the pull to return to old patterns is strong. You want to explain yourself again, smooth things over, or give one more chance just to relieve that internal pressure. And that's exactly where the cycle keeps renewing itself. Not because you don't know better, but because sitting with that discomfort feels harder than going back to what's familiar. Even if what's familiar is painful, it's predictable. And that predictability can feel strangely safer than the unknown. The person who survives learns to sit in that discomfort without immediately trying to escape it. They feel the guilt, but don't let it dictate their actions. They feel the urge to respond, but choose silence. They feel the anxiety of stepping back, yet they hold their ground anyway. This isn't about becoming numb. It's about building the capacity to experience difficult emotions without letting them pull you back into a harmful dynamic. Over time, that discomfort starts to shift. It becomes less intense, less urgent, less controlling, and in its place, something more stable begins to form, a sense of self that isn't constantly reacting. That's when real separation begins, not just physically, but emotionally, because you're no longer making decisions just to avoid feeling uncomfortable. Detachment is often misunderstood as indifference, as if it means you no longer care or that you've somehow shut down emotionally. But in a narcissistic dynamic, detachment is not about a lack of feeling. It's about a shift in where your energy goes. It's the moment you stop feeding a system that depends on your reactions to survive. Confrontation seems like the natural solution when something is wrong. You want to call things out, demand accountability, and stand your ground. But in this kind of dynamic, confrontation often backfires. It can escalate into arguments that go nowhere or get flipped in a way that leaves you defending yourself. Instead, the focus moves away from the issue and onto your reaction. And suddenly, you're pulled deeper into the cycle you were trying to break. Detachment works differently. Instead of trying to correct, prove, or win, you begin to disengage. You don't respond to every provocation. You don't chase every misunderstanding. You don't feel the need to have the last word. And while that might feel unnatural at first, it quietly removes the fuel that keeps the interaction alive. This doesn't mean you never speak up or that you tolerate bad behavior. It means you become selective. You recognize which situations are productive and which are simply loops designed to keep you engaged. And when you consistently choose not to participate in those loops, something shifts. The dynamic loses its intensity. Not because the other person has changed, but because you are no longer reinforcing it. In the end, surviving a narcissist isn't about being stronger, kinder, or more patient than anyone else. It's about stepping into a type of power that most people misunderstand. A quiet, deliberate power rooted in boundaries, emotional independence, and detachment. The person who makes it through is not the one who fights harder or gives more. It's the one who knows when to stop, who can tolerate discomfort without collapsing, and who refuses to let their worth be negotiated or defined by someone else's patterns. They understand that empathy has edges, that closure is something you create internally, and that survival depends on removing accessibility rather than trying to force change. This isn't an easy path, and it doesn't look heroic in the traditional sense, but it is effective. By stepping back, enforcing limits, and choosing self-preservation over engagement, they disrupt the cycle that keeps others stuck. That's the truth most people overlook. The one who survives a narcissist is not the obvious hero. They are the quiet, disciplined, self-aware person who refuses to play by the rules of dysfunction. And in that refusal, they reclaim their life, their clarity, and their freedom.